Okay, hello, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. As always, a lot to get through tonight. As we speak, the cabinet is meeting on how to react to the latest figures in coronavirus. The last few weeks, those who have been with us every week have heard that the numbers in Israel are just getting steadily higher and higher. I think we reached almost 7,000 in a single day yesterday. And that's, we were talking a week or so ago how 5,000 was a massive amount. And, even a few weeks back, even 3,000, 4,000 was a massive amount. So to get to 7,000, granted, testing is up. I think there was even as much as 60 or 70,000 tests throughout the day. So testing is definitely up, but there's around 11% positivity percentage coming back. And so that's risen as well. And that's obviously the important thing to look at. Interestingly enough, I just read a figure that said in the ultra-Orthodox community, it's 25%, which is more than double the national average, and every fourth person who goes to get tested in the ultra-Orthodox community comes back positive. So obviously very worrying numbers there. But basically the discussion in Israel over the last week or so has been, what do we do? What is the answer? We're currently in a lockdown which has so many exceptions. You're allowed to work. Pretty much anyone's allowed to go to work. You're obviously allowed to go for food shopping, you're allowed to go for home improvements, you're allowed to go to demonstrate, you're allowed to go to synagogue, you're allowed to do all these sort of things. And there was a feeling that a lot of people would take advantage of these exceptions because obviously the police can't tell who's telling the truth and who's lying. And the numbers kept steadily rising, even though usually when there's a certain restriction, you don't see the results of it for at least 2 weeks, if not more. But basically there was a feeling that it wasn't being taken seriously. The numbers rose steadily, but there were two major sort of exceptions that either side of the political spectrum wanted to or didn't want to deal with. On the right, a very thorny issue was attendance in synagogues. We are in the middle of the high holy days. We just had Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, next Sunday night, and Monday we'll have Yom Kippur, which some claim is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, and only 5 days after that, on Friday night and Saturday, we have the start of Sukkot, which goes on for a week. So basically, we're in the holiest time of the year for Jews, and the question is, should synagogues be open? To what extent? During Rosh Hashanah, there were some very complicated rules, which we spoke about last week, and basically, there's a feeling from many that synagogues should just be closed and people should pray outside. And it seems like, obviously, that was a very thorny issue. Shas leader Aryeh Deri apparently walked out of the cabinet earlier on in the day because they were going to close down synagogues completely for Yom Kippur. And there's been a big debate about that. Some religious politicians have said they should absolutely close the synagogues, close the yeshivot, the learning seminaries, and basically everyone should pray and learn outside from this point on. But it's a thorny issue that if, for example, we have two chief rabbis in Israel, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, there's a split. The Ashkenazi chief rabbi has said, yes, we should close the synagogues. The Sephardi chief rabbi has said no, but we should limit it. And as we've spoken about before, Netanyahu's last real remaining loyal partner in the coalition are the ultra-Orthodox parties. So for them, it's an important health ministry director met tonight with Rabbi Kamenetsky, who is the leader of a big part of the ultra-Orthodox public. So to convince him would be a major positive for the government to be able to then move into a lockdown, which would include closing synagogues. On the left, the big issue is whether they should allow demonstrations. As people know, there's been strong and significant demonstrations, especially outside the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem, but also in Tel Aviv and other places throughout the country, ongoing for some months now. They've had quite a consistent presence, thousands, even getting to tens of thousands at one point. And basically the left believe that this is, the right to demonstrate is one of the pillars of democracy. And even when the situation is challenging as it is now, that should still remain. Interestingly enough, there was a poll done, undertaken and released. Well, it wasn't undertaken today, but it was released today, which showed that a majority of the Israeli public believe synagogues should close and demonstrations should be curtailed, at least for now. I think about 70% said demonstrations should be stopped during the lockdown, and 60% said synagogues. So there is a massive plurality for both measures. And it seems like both Netanyahu, who represents the right, and Benny Gantz, who's the alternate prime minister who represents the center left, have now come to the conclusion there needs to be a complete lockdown. They're talking about a stronger lockdown than there was even in April and May. We don't know exactly what that means, but it seems that they've come to a consensus that not only will synagogues be closed, the right to demonstrate will be stopped, at least very severely curtailed for the next few weeks. People will not be able to go to work as normal and will be restricted to our homes or within a kilometer of our homes, maybe even less, for the next few weeks. As one can imagine, this has, as we've seen in recent weeks, this has harmed Netanyahu's popularity rating. It's coincidental, but quite good for this webinar that they release polls every Wednesday night here in Israel. And Netanyahu has gone down again in the polls. He's down, his party's down now down to 29 seats. And Naftali Bennett's Yamina party is at 21 or 22. There's still a gap, but a turnover of 4 or 5 seats from Likud to Yamina could change that map considerably. Interestingly enough, they asked an extra question this week, which really could change the map, which everyone is now talking about, is there's a Likud member of Knesset who's the head of what was called the Coronavirus Committee. And since the beginning, she's been a bit of a thorn in the government side whenever the government has wanted to place restrictions. Sometimes that people said were too confusing, whether gyms can be open, but this can be closed, or restaurants can be open, but not takeaway, but this and that. And she was seen by much of the Israeli public to be a rational voice that basically whenever she holds her committee in the Knesset, she asks the experts, the representatives of the relevant ministries to come in and say, show me the data. Until you show me the data, I can't make a decision. At the beginning, she was given a lot of authority where basically she would oversee the government decisions and decide whether they were allowed or not, because obviously in our parliamentary system, the legislature has oversight on the government and has the bottom line decision. When it was seen that she was preventing a lot of the government decisions, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his people basically clipped her wings and took away her authority and gave it to other committees which they had more control over. But she remained head of this committee, made a lot of noise because she was seen as someone who was just being, who was just saying, let me see the figures before we make any rational decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So now the pollsters who took the polls basically asked a party led by her, how many seats would it get? And it showed 8 seats. And at least 3 of them would come from the Likud. Now, that does change the map somewhat because it's a bit of a wild card. There are some conspiracy theorists who believe that this whole difference of opinion between Netanyahu openly disparaged her and claimed that she's responsible for the loss of lives openly on his social media this week. There are those who believe that this is all a show, and they've created this whole show to pick up disappointed Likud voters, people who are disappointed in Netanyahu but still believe in that general political direction. And as soon as elections would be over next time, she would then hand her seats back to the Likud, allowing them to retain their previous strength. That's a bit of a conspiracy theory. It's possible. We talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu being the magician in Israel, and certainly I've spoken many times as a campaign strategist, as a communications person, that there really is no one better to learn from than Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's a step ahead of everybody else. Everyone else is playing checkers and he's playing chess. So it wouldn't surprise me if they were doing something like that. Other events this week, Israel sent over a delegation to Bahrain to try and work out the final normalization agreement, because as we saw with the ceremony in the White House, we signed a normalization agreement with the UAE, but it was just an intention to normalize agreement with Bahrain, so that needs to be worked out. The head of Bahrain and Prime Minister Netanyahu had a good chat this week. And it seems also the F-35 issue with the UAE came up again, with the Americans pretty much confirming that they will go into that process of very probably selling the UAE the important F-35s. This obviously became such an issue that Defense Minister and alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz is currently in the US after meeting with his counterparts to ensure what Israel calls, or what is called, maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge. As we know, Israel quantitatively doesn't have the numbers of its enemies, at least its previous enemies during the wars, of its establishment, 67, 73, etc. We could never count on having anything close to the numbers of our enemies and opponents in the region. So the idea was that Americans would ensure that Israel always had the qualitative military edge, not just by supplying Israel with the latest technology, but also ensuring that they didn't sell it to any other regional actors. The very possible sale of the F-35 to UAE is something which has disturbed some in the defense establishment. So Defense Minister Gantz was in Washington to try and see how that can be worked out, because it's obvious that the Americans made a commitment to the UAE as part of this package deal to sell them the stealth fighters. So what does that mean for Israel? And I'm sure something will be worked out. On another level, Sudanese representatives with the UAE, with Americans, to try and work out their differences. At the moment, the Sudan, at least its leadership, is on sanctions list in the US, and there's been a lot of talk that they'd be brought off because obviously it's an interim government, etc. And part of that is also they're trying to push, or at least trying to work out a way that they will normalize relations with Israel. The Sudanese president, or the interim leader, I should say, of the council, met with Netanyahu in Uganda earlier in the year. So it does seem like it's moving in that direction. So people are assuming that certainly Sudan could be that next country that everyone's talking about to normalize relations with Israel. A lot more to talk about. I'm happy to answer your questions at this point.
Right, thank you so much. So the first question is what's the general consensus of how much of the COVID spike in numbers is due to increased testing versus just an increase?
Well, as I said, there's certainly been an increase in testing and an increase in numbers, but the thing to look for is the percentage of positive, what I think they call morbidity. Basically, that is going up. I mean, we had at one point, there was a 1 or 2% positivity rating. So it doesn't matter if it's 1,000 tests, 100 tests, 100,000 tests. 1% is obviously very low. But the fact that we're now up to 11%, that means 1 in 10 people who are being tested, more than 1 in 10, are coming back with a positive result. So it doesn't really matter how many are being tested. Israel's increased capacity certainly means more positive. But basically, it's just saying what the situation is. You know, we've always known that there's a lot more people who have the virus than we know about. So obviously, in every country where there's going to be increased testing, there will be an increase in the number of infections. But with all that, as I said, the key number to look for in every day is not necessarily the number of infections, not necessarily the number of tests, although that is important, it's how much percentage comes back. And 11% is extremely high, and I think one of the highest around the world at this point in time.
So speaking of, we talked about this last week, but has there been any change in the severity of the positive corona tests?
Has there been any, sorry, I don't understand the question.
Change in the severity?
Of the testing?
But just the cases of corona. We talked about.
Sorry, as many. They haven't gone up as much. The number of serious cases or the number of hospitalized, this is basically the key for any country, as we saw in Italy and Spain, where the health system gets overwhelmed. No country wants to see that. So Israel has a certain capacity. That's a lot of people complaining that our capacity is far too low, that we've only got 500, 600, 700 hospitalizations, and the whole country has to shut down as a result. That's basically an underfunded system. We haven't really massively increased the number of beds and capacity since the first wave, and that's a lot of people have a problem with that. Some say, I think only 13 beds were. It was increased by 13 beds from the first wave to the second wave, and obviously that's not good enough for the amount that we're seeing. But we're definitely seeing higher numbers of serious cases. We're seeing more people on ventilators and certainly more people dying. I think today there was 31 people who died, and that's a very big number considering only a month or so ago we were in single figures. So these numbers are certainly going up. So the seriousness of the cases is going up. There is a big debate in Israel exactly if and when the system will be overwhelmed. And there's a big disagreement amongst the hospitals. Earlier in the week, the health ministry put out all these figures that says that almost every hospital is over 100% capacity, said that certain hospitals are 130% capacity, and then suddenly these numbers were gone. And they asked the hospitals themselves, and for example, one hospital called Sheba Hospital was said to be 130% capacity, and they actually said, actually, we're only at 50%. So the health ministry had to scrub the numbers completely. And they said there's no known data. It went from numbers to no known data. So there's something went wrong there, but it's clear that regardless of what the true numbers are, we certainly don't want to get to a case where the numbers are so great that you have to start turning people away and you have to choose who to treat and who not to treat. That's the biggest fear in the system. What we do certainly see is we see that the capacity is far greater, or the numbers are far greater, let's say in the north, with a lot of Arab towns and villages are populated, and also in places like Jerusalem with a high ultra-Orthodox and Arab population. Other areas don't have the same level of intensity in their hospital capacity, but still we're seeing, regardless of where it is today, it's clear that the numbers are just going up and up, and it will overwhelm the system eventually if we allow it to.
So you mentioned that there are quite a few exceptions to the lockdown. Is there any contact tracing going on there, using cell phone locations, or just tracking the contacts with the positive tests?
Yes, I mean the way it works is that as soon as someone has their test come back positive, basically what they do is they track everyone who was in a certain radius for a certain amount of time. Usually they judge it if you're within 2 meters of someone for over 15 minutes, then they then receive a message, which means that they have to go into isolation for 2 weeks. If they're feeling symptoms, if they're feeling unwell or have symptoms, then they also go for a test. But there's been a lot of criticisms, and a lot of people have gone into lockdown where they didn't need to. But basically, one of the major problems, and something I didn't speak about, is, interestingly enough, Naftali Bennett, the leader of Yamina, who we spoke about a little bit earlier, he came up with a 20-point plan of what he would do if he was leading the country. That's a sort of positive, I hesitate to call it stunt, but certainly communications message that people relate to. They don't necessarily just want to hear people bashing the leadership, but come up with their own ideas. And he certainly did that this week, and got a lot of positive coverage. And one of the things he did criticize, or he said that he would do, is epidemiological testing, where we understand the sources of major spreads and deal with it in a far more clever manner than we are just reacting to the situation rather than being proactive. So that's not happening at this moment. That's something Naftali Bennett certainly has called for, and a lot of the public are calling for. So the numbers, as I said, are still going up, and at the moment they're pretty much out of control. And the lockdown, the idea of the lockdown is to really get them under control and start moving in the negative direction again.
Thank you. You just mentioned the 20-point plan. We actually had a question come in about that. Can you give us your opinion of it, as well as a brief rundown for our viewers who may not know?
I don't think I'll be able to repeat all the 20 points. I would recommend anyone who wants to read it. Naftali Bennett has posted it on his own personal Facebook page, also in English and also in Hebrew. It's pretty comprehensive. It really does deal with all sorts of issues. His main thing is if we just put a lot more resources into convincing people to wear masks, then we could deal with this in 6 weeks. His major headline from his 20 points is, we could deal with this in 6 weeks. We completely, I don't think he uses the word get rid of coronavirus, but certainly take the numbers down within 6 weeks. As I said, it's a very good positive message. 20 points is, to my mind, a little bit too much. As a communication strategist, people can't really relate 20 messages. It was my suggestion to a number of MKs a while back that you should have 4 or 5 very pointed, very consistent and convincing messages, positive messages that would be able to deal with the coronavirus arguably better than the current leadership. But I can tell you that Naftali Bennett, and we can see this in the polls, the fact that he's taking a positive line rather than bashing the government, he's saying this is what I would do, is resonating with the public. And the fact that he went into such great detail, for those who have the time, the energy to read them, they're quite, I would say, pretty good suggestions, especially from someone like me who's not a medical expert, but they make a lot of sense. And certainly these are 20 things that the government is not currently doing.
Wonderful, thank you. So moving on to the UAE, how large is the UAE's military force, and do they have trained air force that can use the F-35s, or is it a possibility that the planes will wind up in another country's hands?
No, I don't think so. You know, the Americans, first of all, interestingly enough, David Friedman, who's the American ambassador to Israel, said today that, you know, at the best case scenario, nothing will happen for 7 or 8 years. You know, these deals take a lot of time. There's a lot of training. They have to, you know, obviously get the hardware specific for the country itself. You know, it's not just a simple, you know, they have a few sitting around in the warehouse and then they just send them off, you know, in a couple of days, a couple of weeks. These things take a lot of time. You know, when Israel orders a certain, you know, new technology, it can take a long while, and a big part of that is training. You have to obviously train the personnel to this new technology, and the F-35 is a new age stealth fighter plane. I'm assuming, I'm not an expert on the UAE's military, but I'm assuming that they wouldn't ask for it if they didn't think that they would have the capability to use it. And I don't see them, you know, having it and then allowing another country to have it. The Americans are too astute to just give away the hardware without severe and very strict conditions. So, you know, from now until the point where a UAE pilot gets into an F-35 that is theirs is many years away. So I think that hopefully answers that question.
Thank you. Do you think that the peace agreement with Bahrain will filter down to the population since it's a majority Shia Muslims?
It's a good question. There is a lot of work by Iran, specifically in Bahrain, because obviously Iran is the Shiite nation, and Bahrain does have a Shiite majority. There was a lot of complaints during the Arab Spring that Iran was, and it most certainly was, putting a lot of pressure, putting out a lot of propaganda to try and topple the leadership there, and that's still ongoing. We have seen positive vibes, let's say, from Bahrainis, just as we have seen from Emiratis towards this peace agreement, but it's certainly a lot more sensitivities because of the makeup of their population. But just because someone is Shia doesn't necessarily mean that they are a supporter of Iran or they're open to Iran's advancements. But there still is going to be a pocket of the public, the population, that will buy the Iranian rhetoric. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to be an unpopular decision to normalize relations with Israel from within Bahrain.
Thank you. And how influential do you think the interim government of Sudan is in this normalization of relations with Israel?
Well, it's an interesting one because they call it interim, and a few weeks ago, the leader, the head of the interim council, basically said that he doesn't have the authority to normalize relations with Israel because they're interim and they have to wait until after elections. But at the end of the day, I can tell you, Sudan want more than anything else is to have the sanctions lifted. That is extremely crucial for everything, for their economy, for diplomatic relations, to be welcomed back into the family of nations. So if the Americans do dangle the possibility of sanctions relief at this point, I think Sudan will pretty much sign on to anything, including normalization with Israel. So I think that's probably what's happening, even though the Sudanese representatives have now left the region and gone back without an agreement. But again, I think the Israel factor here in Israel and those who are interested in Israel, that for us is a big issue. But at the end of the day, for the Sudanese, the big issue is the sanctions relief. And I think Israel's sort of a passing issue, but something that may get put into the wider basket of these talks.
Thank you. And has there been any movement under the radar with the Palestinians in terms of a negotiation for a two-state solution?
Quite simply, no. The Palestinians, if anything, are moving further away from it. There seems to be agreements between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, obviously to fight against these normalization agreements. Interestingly enough, we spoke about it a few weeks ago, but the Arab League is still very much not taking the Palestinian cause as, let's say, as seriously as they've had previously. They used to have Palestinians used to have pretty much an open door to whatever policies they wanted to push in the Arab League, but that's certainly not the case anymore. The Palestinians are extremely frustrated with this, but there's no signs that this frustration will lead to any sort of openings at this point to indirect, let alone direct negotiations. So I don't see that happening in the near future. As I said, if anything, they seem to be moving away from that. They seem to be moving to a point where they're calling for a third intifada, they're calling for violent rejectionism. So I think the chances of any sort of negotiations, even indirect, are very minor at this point. I think Stacey has gone, so I'm going to read a question because I also have access to the questions. What made you strongly believe prior to the UAE-Bahrain agreements the annexation issue was, if it all happened, a minimal annexation? I think this point is that I said, when the annexation issue was on the table, that I didn't believe there was going to be too much of an annexation, and it was going to be more of a minimal annexation, because quite simply I felt, and this has been proven out, that for Prime Minister Netanyahu, it was never a major thrust, it was never a priority for him. It was an election promise that he kind of just had to abide by, and it got a bit of momentum from the meeting with President Trump in the White House, but I never believed it was he had a really strong intention to do much there. I thought he would do something, but with everything else on the table, with the normalization agreements, it's been shunted aside quite easily. Stacey, I just decided to ask myself a question from one of the questions we have.
Perfect. So sorry, I'm having some internet difficulties.
Yeah.
All right, well, that takes us up to the half hour. We've come to the close of our webinar. Ashley, thank you again for taking the time to update us.
Absolutely, thank you.
Good luck with the lockdown. And for our viewers, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a great day.